All right, everyone, welcome to the somewhat long and likely somewhat rambly explanation for how the redstone behind the chessboard actually works. If you somehow got here without seeing the original video, I'm going to go ahead and link that now. You can take a look at that for a little bit of context. And otherwise, if you have a specific circuit that you want to see how it works, I'm going to leave timestamps down below in the description that will go over just the different pieces I'm going to cover, so you can jump directly to that. Other than that, the only real details to get out of the way are, as you may have noticed, this is a much lower effort, much less planned, and much more rambly video than the other one. So it's just going to happen how it is. It's likely going to be pretty long, even though I say I'm not going to get too in-depth. I know myself. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get right into it. All right, the first thing to get out of the way is probably just the general overall organization of this thing. So I'm going to start this in more or less the order that I planned and built it, and we'll just go from there. So to start off with, we've got the display bits all in the front here. This is essentially all of the quartz in the front is just, taking input and display those pieces onto the board. The display lines go all the way back here, and all these lines going on here that you see when I peek through the bottom here are really just a bunch of crisscross wires that bring signals to other places. There's no actual logic going on here. So there's the lines for the display. There's these lines that keep track of the different locations of each piece. We've got lines to add and delete pieces to the board. We've also got some stuff to turn on the piece logic for a specific square, which I call making that square smart. And I think that actually might be everything in there. Point is, there's actually a fair amount. If we go in here, there's not very much space. So I really wasn't able to fit much actual logic in here. It's really just, like I said, buses that go from one place to the other. Right on the outside of this middle section, we have the piece memory. So this side has the black pieces, that side over there has the white pieces, and each piece is a different color. So for instance, you see this memory cell here in orange wool. Orange is for pawns. We've got magenta for knights, light blue for rooks, yellow for bishops, lime for queens, and pink for kings. And that's, of course, mirrored on the other side as well. Directly outside of those things, we have the piece logic. So we have memory cells there, and then we have piece logic for kings, queens, all the way down there. And then, of course, we've just got some wires out here to collect all the results into one place and make them queryable so that we can actually use those results to determine what a legal move is. This back part here is essentially all controls for these wires in the middle. So the things that I said of, making the pieces smart, adding, removing pieces to the board, things like that. Those all go into the back here because this back area is where all of those controls come out and are actually usable. So this is going to be the place where your inputs go to do things like ask what color piece is at this square, or, okay, we're making a move, so let's delete the piece at this square, that type of thing. And that's all happening in this kind of crisscrossy thing over here. The actual timing and controls for all these things are run from down here. So we've got some circuits, some red coders, some XY decoders and stuff down here that will actually operate these things. So these are the things that actually control the timings for when do we send the signals to delete pieces or add pieces or things like that. Or in this case is when do we actually send out a query for what color pieces at a square or something like that. And the other major thing to bring up here is the game state manager, or the kind of central logic unit sort of thing going on here. It's really just a shift register that keeps track of whose turn it is and redirects their inputs based on what the current state of the game is. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, later in the video. But yeah, that's pretty much the general layout of things. So I think with that out of the way, we can go ahead and start talking some specifics. Right, this display unit is actually the only thing that I have built separate from the rest of the board, because this was actually the first thing I made, so it was kind of in a prototype stage. You can see the little initial designs I had when I was trying to figure out what the pieces looked like. But all this display unit really is people use 7-segment displays for numbers. This is essentially a 20-segment display, and a lot of these segments do really small granular things. Okay, that one literally just turns on one lamp, things like that. Probably a lot of these are actually just single lamps, or maybe a row of or a pair of lamps or something like that. I think it was this one I found that is a little bit more. Yeah, I used this one for the kings and stuff like that. But essentially what happens is that I have these segments, and then it's just a matter of figuring out, okay, which segments do I need to turn on to make the shapes for each different piece? And that gets controlled by essentially a signal strength decoder here. And what happens, let me turn one of these on. That'll probably be the easiest way to explain this. So let's put a pawn here. Right. Oh, that's right. This is the old, I'm in 116 and this doesn't work anymore. We're just going to get rid of this for the time being. Okay, cool. 115 is cool. So which piece is this? This is a pawn, right? Okay, so when you activate a pawn, all that happens is this one, in this case, turns on, looks like a single segment, and, you know, that makes the outline of the pawn. If we put a different piece in here, let's say, let's put this back. Let's make this, I think 2 is a knight. Maybe, actually, what I'm going to do, you can get rid of that, right? Yeah, sure, that works. That's not what I meant, but whatever. But yeah, so that one makes the knight, right? So it's essentially just a signal strength decoder that does actually work in 116 in the actual version that I'm going to put up for download. And then those towers just go activate the different segments that correspond to that piece, and that's really all there is to it. The only other thing to mention is the color. That is a separate segment over here that's controlled completely independently, and that just goes on and turns on the corner. So this is a white piece, and now it's a black piece. So I guess it's technically a 21 segment display. I don't know. Doesn't really matter. But yeah, so once I have these made, they tile next to each other pretty well. And so it's just a matter of stack a bunch of those things next to each other and make the colors a bit easier on the eyes, and you've got the board. All right, so there's not too much of note to say about the actual memory arrays themselves, other than they are just arrays of memory cells. We're going to get to how they're actually controlled in a bit. The only thing I really want to call out here is how they interface with the display itself, right? Because the display has lines that go all the way back here. Like if we follow this line, it goes all the way back to the kings. But basically, what's going on is whenever a piece is turned on in memory, so for instance, I think if I go, this is black, so if we go up here, we can find one that's on here. Yep, here we go. So here's what it looks like on. You'll see this signal comes over here. This one puts a specific signal strength into the display line so that when it reaches the board, it's displaying 1. Never mind the fact that this is an old design of a red coder. So it displays the correct piece. If we go over to the next one, you'll see here's the next memory cell. This one goes over 1 to the second row and does the same thing. And so essentially all the pieces just do this thing where they their memory cell sends one line across until it reaches the display line that it wants to touch. And then once it gets there, it just puts a very specific signal strength into that wire so that it reaches the board with the correct output strength. You can see if we go up here, instead of pawns, we're looking at different pieces. So yeah, that's what's going on here. All right, adding pieces is where things start to get a tad bit complicated because there are a lot of pieces on the board. In fact, there's 12 different types of pieces. There's 6 pieces types for each player, and then 2 players, so that results in 12 different pieces. And in particular, there's not a whole ton of space in here, so I wanted to come up with a pretty compact way of saying when I add a piece to the board, or in this square in the board, how do I know what piece I'm going to add? And I'm doing that, as you can probably see here, by signal strength. So the idea is that once a signal strength comes in here, this specifies what piece am I going to add. So for instance, signal strength of 1 is a black pawn, then we have black knight, black rook, then the same thing all the way up through king, and the same thing for the white players up on this side. So what happens is as this goes down the green line here, in certain places I will pull off outputs and just say, okay, at this point, if the signal strength is, say, I don't know, 7, it's definitely not 7 here, but I don't know what number it would be exactly here. I'll say, so if the signal strength is 7, then we have a little signal strength decoder here that basically says if it's anything greater than or less than 7, don't output anything. If it's exactly 7, let the signal through. That goes through to the ribbon cables down here, and these ribbon cables, if we were to follow it, eventually make their way over to the memory cell. So you can see it goes into this thing here, and then that turns on this memory cell, this queen here. So when I add a queen to that spot on the board, it means that I am sending a specific signal strength that corresponds to that queen into this line. It then goes, navigates its way over there, and eventually turns that memory cell on. While I'm here, I'm also going to call out these ribbon cables. It's not a super complicated thing, but I just like the way ribbon cables look. The trick here, if you've never seen them before, is that signal or redstone maximum signal strength is 15, and these repeaters are all exactly 15 blocks apart. So even though it looks like they'll interfere with each other, they actually don't. Because if this white repeater is on, so let's put a torch here, as though this white repeater is on, there's enough signal strength so that it only reaches this white repeater over here. Same all the way down. So even though these look like they interfere with each other, they actually don't because they're placed a very specific distance apart. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else calls these ribbon cables, but I call them ribbon cables because they look like ribbon cables and they look really cool, and I really like them. Removing a piece is similar in concept, although much more straightforward because for each square, we don't care what type of piece we're removing. We're really just saying remove the piece that's at this square. So we start at the same place. We're at the back of the board here, and when this line turns on, we basically just go all the way to whatever piece or whatever memory cells correspond to this piece, and we branch out and say, okay, hey, the red line turned on. Let's go over here and lock this comparator so that this memory cell gets deleted. And so if there is anything there, it gets deleted, so that piece is gone. If there's nothing there, then obviously nothing changes and no harm is done. And this goes on all the way for all of the different memory cells that correspond to the square, and is of course repeated for all of the squares on the board. Right, and we're once again at the back of the board. The last thing that starts here is what I call making the pieces smart. That just turns on the movement logic, so it says for the piece that's at this given square, tell me what moves are legal for that piece. And so when this line turns on, this travels down the blue wall, and this is eventually going to, I'm going to put myself in spectator mode, this is eventually going to branch out once we get to the right point and say, okay, cool, we've reached a memory cell that corresponds to the square, and now we're going to come over here, and right now you'll notice that the comparator that comes out of this memory cell is currently locked, so if there were a piece here, no signal would get through. However, once this torch turns off, we're turning the logic on for this square, we're making this piece smart, and so this comparator would start allowing a signal through, and that is then going into the movement logic. And so whatever the movement logic is going to do for that piece, it will eventually spit out, here are the legal moves for that piece. And then once the torch turns back on, we've turned off the smarts for that piece, and obviously, things go back to the way they were before. Right, another thing you probably noticed when I was looking at the ribbon cables for adding things earlier is that the green wires are not the only things on these ribbon cables. We also have these gray and white wires as well, and those correspond to piece locators for everything on the board. So for instance, here is a memory cell for a black king. If we come over here, let's see, somewhere this thing is going to be turning on a gray wire. It's probably happening right here, right? So what this signal comes up here, goes to this gray wire, and this then turns on these wires that go across. These wires here that I'm looking at right now, or that I'm, standing inside of, go in the same direction as the display wires. So if we were to go in this direction, we would eventually hit the front of the board. If we were to go in the other direction here, we would eventually hit the back of the board where all the main controls are. And this part of the wires are used to answer questions about what color piece is at a given square. And they also interface with the ribbons up here. So you'll notice that this thing up here, eventually, actually, no, this is part of the two-way repeater. At some point, here we go, this thing, when the wire turns on, this torch will turn on, and this will turn on this ribbon in the ribbon cable. And these come over here to the piece movement logic. So essentially, the end result of this is that once we turn on a given memory cell for a piece, the information that there is a black piece or a white piece at this square is communicated both to all of the different movement logics across the entire board and also to the back of the board, so we can ask very easily what color piece is at this square. I forgot to mention in that last clip before I hit stop recording, but I'm just going to make a second clip now. These are actually two-way repeaters, so if a piece gets put into memory over here, say this thing powers it here, the signal will propagate down this line, but say a pawn gets turned on over here, that means the signal will be going the other way. So for instance, if this repeater turns on, the signal will be going this way. Two-way repeaters are cool. They're kind of bulky, but they let you do some cool things like this. Felt that was worth explicitly mentioning because I know they're not secret, they're not uncommon, but I don't see them very often. or at all, because I'm not sure if anyone actually does redstone like this besides me anymore. But they're cool, trust me. All right, movement logic is something that I built a long time ago, and hopefully I remember how it works well enough to explain it. Luckily, we're going to start with pawns, and pawns are the pretty easy ones. So right now we're looking at the black pawns. The white pawns, I'm not going to explicitly show you. It's the same thing, just in reverse. So as a quick refresh, if you don't know how chess works, pawns can move one block, or one block forwards, unless there is a piece in front of them. And if they are capturing a piece, they must capture it diagonally, and that's the only way they can move diagonally. The only exception to this is the very first move. They can move down 2 rows, although that's pretty much the exact same setup as what we have going here. So the idea here is that once a pawn is made smart, if there were a signal here, that signal would travel through here, down this torch tower to the row below it, and the first place we come is here, and we say, okay, this is 1 block in front of us, so is there another piece in front of us? That would be if this dust is on or this dust is on, that means there's a black piece or a white piece in front of us, and so we cannot move here. If none of these are on, the signal passes right on through, and this goes on to say, yep, that's a legal move. While we're here, we also go down a little bit, and we go in 2 directions. We go to the left through this repeater here, and we go to the right through this repeater here, and we specifically say, if there is a white piece here, then we're going to let this signal through, and that comes also to the legal move line. And so that's essentially the part that says, okay, if we're going to capture a piece, we need to capture it diagonally. And then, like I said, the ones all the way up here, these ones can move 2 blocks forward, and this is done in pretty much exactly the way you would think. This comes down here, and if you are allowed to make this first move, in addition to going out to the legal move thing, it also just comes down here and turns on the next line as well. So that's really all that's going on for the pawns. Off to a good start. All right, the knight's movement logic is a bit wonky, but is ultimately pretty simple, because the knights don't have any dependencies on the places they can move other than the pieces that are currently there. It's literally just they make their L-shaped move, and if there's a piece there, then they can't go there. If there is no piece there, then you're good to go. And so it's really just a matter of routing the things to get to all of the right squares, and then just blocking those things if there's a piece in the way. So you can see here, once the signal comes in here, we go up this tower, and eventually this tower gets high enough that it says, okay, cool, let's go 2 squares over, and then here's going 2 squares the other direction. Then we go up a little bit more, we say, okay, let's go 1 square over and 1 square in the other direction, and so that handles the upwards half of all our moves. If we follow these blue lines a bit, because this comes from here, these ones continue. We do a little cauldron trick to get over some flat wires that I couldn't otherwise get over. And then when we get over here, we start going down this torch tower and just do the same thing. We go down far enough until we say, okay, cool, hey, let's go over this way. And then we go back the other way, and we do the same thing for the 1 squares as well. And then we have the black wires here that correspond to the black pieces from our piece locators earlier, and they pretty much just come over here and say, hey, if there is a piece of our own color over here, then don't let this through, because that's not a legal move. And that's really all there is to it, because like I said, ultimately, what is this piston doing here? I don't know. You saw nothing. All right, the rook logic is where things start to get fun, because the rooks are the first piece that does the thing in chess where it essentially continues along a path until it gets blocked. So the trick here is that I need to come up with something that this allows the signal to propagate potentially all the way through the entire board, but has places in it that I can stop that signal from traveling built in, so that if there's a piece in the way, obviously we stop. And so what I ended up doing for here is, for each direction, we come over here. So for instance, this one goes up, and we follow this torch tower. And if we follow this through here, we eventually end up pretty much back in the same place in the next row, which is how the propagation works. So essentially for each row, we say, go up to the next one, and then feed yourself back into that same input, kind of like a recursion type of thing. And you'll notice as we get here, there are some places where the power can be blocked by one of the colored wires. So for instance, this white wire here, if this repeater is on, then that will power this dust, which will essentially lock it on, which is essentially saying if there is a white piece here, then you should not be allowed to progress any further because you need to stop. The only tricky part to this is that you need to treat the different colored pieces differently, because if it's one of your own pieces, then you can't move to that square at all. But if it's one of the enemy's pieces, you can move onto that square to capture it. You just can't move past that square. And so you have to treat those differently, because it would obviously be quite a shame if you were able to either capture your own pieces or not capture the enemy's pieces. Yeah, so beyond that, this pretty much the same thing happens for the other directions. So if we continue on here, we eventually get to this thing, which does the same thing, but it goes down instead of up. If we continue on, we get to these things over here. Eventually, yeah, so you'll see when this dust turns on, these are how I do the side-to-side ones. The comparator reads this signal through this block and essentially goes all the way across, and then we have the same thing going the other direction here. And then all of these things get fed into the purple wire that's the legal move. And I'll point out, because I think it is kind of satisfying to look at, the way these comparators get powered is by these pieces of dust in the side, and these get powered by these weird little block things of the alternating torch towers. So these are actually two different inputs. This one here is getting powered by this black one and this white one. This one here is getting powered by this black one and this white one, and they kind of alternate right past each other, and it's really neat to look at. And I just kind of I like how it turned out. It's a cool looking circuit, and it functions pretty well. It's not the fastest thing, but it works. In concept, the bishop logic is pretty much the same as the rook's logic, except instead of going up and down and side to side, it goes diagonally in all four directions. So I'm not going to look at it too closely, part because it's the same, and part because this thing is actually a mess, and I couldn't actually find all four directions when I was looking in here right before I turned on the recording. I found the one here that goes up in this direction, but I never found the other up direction. Wait, is this it right here, actually? No, there's nothing on the... Yeah, I don't know where the other up direction is. I know it exists because I've used it. Is this it, maybe? What's this block connect to? Oh, no, this goes down. Yeah, this is where it starts going down. Yeah, we have down this way, and then we have down this way. So yeah, I legitimately have no idea where the other up direction is. I've lost it. I know it exists. I've used it before, but like... It could be just anywhere at this point. I genuinely have no idea. Now, the cool thing about the queen logic is that if you understand how the rooks work and you understand how the bishops work, then you also understand how the queens work. Because if you look at the movement patterns, the queens essentially have all the same legal moves as the rooks and bishops combined. So to reflect this, the queens, if you look at it, I copy-pasted the rook's movement logic, and then, on top of it, copy-pasted the bishop's movement logic and just kind of combined the two results together into some massive monster that just does the same thing as both of them combined. Yeah, science. Right, now, the king's logic is, in execution, somewhat similar to the knight's logic. The only difference is that the kings don't have as far they need to move. They really just say, okay, let's go to all the squares around us. And if there is one of our own pieces there, we can't move there. Otherwise, we're good to go. It's worth noting that the king's logic here does not account for being in check. We do that later on in the process. That's not something that we have access to right now, because while we know the colors of the pieces around us, we don't know what those pieces actually are, and so we don't know what the opponent's legal moves are at this point, so we can't determine whether or not we're in check. So we have to do that later. But yeah, so the king's logic itself essentially just starts out in here and essentially just goes and immediately splits off in a whole bunch of directions, and then they all convene in these lines up here, which eventually make their way out here into the purple line. So, for instance, you'll see that like if we follow this here, we go into this torch tower, which brings us straight up into the row right above us. And then if we, for this to go a little bit further, we get to these things that these bring us diagonally up to the ones right next to us. Things like, or these ones bring us horizontally. We have others that bring us diagonally. We have ones further on here that bring us down, so on and so forth. It's essentially just a whole crisscross of wires that just go in the one direction that they need to go to, and all the outputs get merged together and spit out into the purple. I do think it's interesting, just the massive honey block chain here, because I needed to get the color input through here, and there really wasn't much space at all. And so honey blocks were the solution I came up with. I don't actually know. Uh, there was some point where it was relevant that these were honey blocks instead of slime blocks. I don't know if that made it into the final version or if I ended up changing that, because I thought it was here, but I'm not seeing anything here that seems to indicate that. But the reason I made that comment in the video is that honey blocks actually do not block redstone signal. So for instance, if I put a block here, this goes through. However, slime blocks would block this signal, and there was a time when that was actually important because I needed signal to be able to go through here. Uh, Ends up not looking like that was the case, unless it was somewhere else that I had to make that decision and it wasn't actually here. I'm just remembering it wrong. But yeah, so the color input comes through here, goes onto this thing, and eventually, I hit the wrong button, eventually comes out here and just blocks the comparator just like it did it in the Knight's movement logic. So that's really all that's going on with the Kings. All right, the main circuit behind the control panels is actually just this brown wool thing behind here. Once we get an output from it, it's just a signal strength out, and that just goes into these lines over here, and they get unblocked when you press the pistons. The thing of these that are noteworthy is that the behavior of this is actually very specific. So like if you stand on, what I have hitboxes on, if you throw a single thing on here, then you'll notice that we are able to get an output. Why are we not? Oh, probably because it's being blocked from the button. So I think if I press one of these, then you can see that output flashed right here. It didn't actually do anything because it's being locked down there. But if I were to throw another thing on, let's say I toss this over here so that more than one thing is being pressed, and I press this button again, I'm watching this wire down here. Press it again, and nothing happens this time. And that is being accomplished through, pick these up, through this circuit that I have isolated down here, which is kind of cool. Basically, the idea is that if there's more than one thing being powered here, then it's not going to let it through. So here we have one thing, and you'll notice it lets the signal strength through. If I were to move this further down, then it lets different signal strength through. But if we have both of these powered, then nothing at all goes through here. And the way it's doing that is that it's basically on one side, it's inverting this with this comparator here, and then it's comparing the signal strengths so that it says, okay, when these things come together, if there's more than one thing powering it, then these will have different signal strengths after the inversion, and so it will detect that and will block them. However, if there's only one thing, then they will both have the same signal strength after the inversion, and that's the signal strength that goes through into the output. So I have one of those on each axis of the control panel thing, and so that makes it so that if you're standing on exactly one square, then you can press one of the buttons and the input will go through. And if you're standing on more than one square, then that's unclear, and so it will block that from happening. From there, those inputs just kind of go down here into this nice instant wire thing that I have. And this is it's pretty much the normal instant wire design. However, you'll notice that instead of one piston, I've kind of moved the wire onto the side so that I can power all these from the side, so that if I say, depower two of these things, then it'll be two pistons going all the way down the line to the very end. And then it does the normal instant wire thing of, you have to wait for it to reset and everything. But that's essentially what's going on with the control panels. There's a fair amount of just weird timing and stuff, and how I set up the buttons and everything that I'm kind of skipping over. But that's basically how it works. All right, so the game state manager is what controls the current state of the game. It's essentially the central thing that gets consulted for whenever some input happens. What do you need to do with it? And it's actually just a pretty standard shift register that has 4 states. We have each player picks and then moves. So this is the only thing you're allowed to do is select a piece. The things you're allowed to do are either select a different piece or move the piece you've already selected. And then these ones are for the other player. And so essentially, when any one of these are on, that will dictate that we're in that state. And then we can go to the pistons up here to shift it around. There's a line right in here that will power them. I'm not going to talk about what each state does right now. I think instead it'll be better to talk about that as we get to the places that those states affect. So that's really the only thing to keep in mind here for the time being, is that it's a shift register that contains 4 different states depending on what the players are currently allowed to do. Relatively straightforward at this point. There is actually one thing important about the game state manager that I forgot to mention, and that is that it interacts with the control panels. So once one of these things turns on, you'll see here if this state turns on, then this goes to a pulse generator, and this goes back to the control panels, and it controls the locks. Because if you'll recall, when I was talking about the control panels earlier, I mentioned that they were locked. And so this means that when it's White's turn, we need to unlock White's control panel. So that just comes over here. There's a little memory thing down here that just unlocks this dust and stops it from going through. And so, yeah, that's the only function that the game state manager has that does not interact with the actual logic, because it just needs to happen in order for the logic to be able to do something. Now, one place that your input always goes when it's able to is through into these cyan memory cells here, and these go into a decoder in the board that actually will, so if we follow this, it goes through these 2 decoders here. One of them's for the columns and one of those for the rows, and up into these sequence of things over here. If we follow, I think I'm following the rows right now. Yeah, follow one of the rows. These go up here, and these go into a basically big XY decoder in the back of the board. So if we follow this row here, we'll see comes over here, eventually goes up one of these half slabs and into this little section here. This other repeater is the other input. This is the one from the column. So this is a stack of half slabs that goes for this whole column. And so when both of these go off, both this repeater and the line underneath here, that means that this square was selected. And so that turns off this repeater and unlocks this thing here that is just a query for what color piece is on the square. So right now this piece is white. That's because this white line is on here. And so that unlocks this comparator, goes in here. If it were black, then the black line would be on. And if it were neither, then the sandstone one would turn on. No matter which one goes on, all 3 of those lines end up coming over here. We're going to just go into spectator mode. They come over here, and they all go down. I flew right past it. They all go down in this giant mess of these 3 towers kind of spiraling down here. They end up around here. Yeah, here. And at this point, their behavior splits based on whatever the game state currently is. So essentially what happens is if your piece is picked, or if rather you've picked a square that has your colored piece on it, then it will go over here and save them in one of these memory cells that are somewhere in this general area. I found them earlier. I don't remember where. Here we go. These ones here. These ones save the location of the piece that is being moved. There's another one over there for the other side. But so these get saved here so that we can use that position later. The other thing that it does is it sends those things into these pieces of instant wire. So if we follow this instant wire, these are the ones that go all the way back to the control panel, and they control the little piston grid. So that's the thing that retracts the block that you've selected when you're standing on it. So that way it's just a visual indicator if you wait or are thinking too long and forget which piece you currently have selected. And that's really just a couple memory cells that get decoded, and again a whole bunch of weird timing things and just a lot of stuff to make the grids line up, because that's a kind of compact display. The other place where this input goes is, let's get back here. So yeah, when you select a square that has your colored piece on it, one of these lines from the game state manager lights up, and it comes out in this general area. Here we go. It's this line right here. This goes up here, and this starts a query, or rather, it starts the process of collecting the movement results. So when this line flashes, it starts to say, hey, we've made one of the pieces smart, and so now we need to wait until it's done, and then at that point we'll know what all the legal moves are. And the only part of this process we're missing so far is the part I kind of skipped over when I said, hey, we made all the pieces smart, because up to this point we haven't actually made that piece smart. That happens somewhere over here. I'm going to stay in spectator mode for a bit. Somewhere over here there's a memory cell that I, again, found. Here we go, this thing. This thing, when you select a piece of your own color, will get flipped. This line turns off. And so if we follow this up here, let's say, this goes over to this torch and does 2 things. One, you'll recognize this is the intersection place of the XY thing. So this is the square that we've selected. And when this blue line turns off, it will lock on this one, so it stops the query of what color is on this square, and it unlocks this line, which comes down here, and I hit too many buttons, which comes down here, and this makes the piece smart. So overall, what happens when you select a piece of your color, you make that piece smart, and then you send this line over here to say, okay, let's start the process of collecting all those results, and then you tell me when you're done collecting results so we know what all of the legal moves are. So for most of this purple concrete, there's not too much to say. It just takes the output of the movement logic and just, collects it all into one place. The thing I do want to call out here is this line here. What block is this? Purple terracotta. This is storing what type of piece is currently active in memory. So this, anytime a queen is active, one of these things will turn on. That will turn off the instant wire, and that will put a very specific signal strength in this line down here, so that eventually that gets collected here. The only other real thing of note that the purple concrete does is this is the thing that keeps track of when the movement logic is still happening versus when it's done, because that's not necessarily a fixed amount of time. For instance, like if you have a rook that has to move all the way from the bottom to the top of the board, remember that's kind of a propagating process that, first this row will light up, then this row will light up, then the next row, then the next row, and things like that. And so that will take a different amount of time depending on how many rows it has to go, and I want to cut that process off as soon as possible because it's the slowest part of this board by far, and it's generally the bottleneck for that you have to wait on for most other things to happen. So to do that, I have essentially multiple parts here. Essentially, once you start this query from the game state manager thing, there's two timers that get started. There's this fader clock here, which is essentially a constant timer of here's the minimum amount of time that is required for the movement logic to be done. And then it starts this smaller timer here, which essentially says any time that a change occurs, this timer will restart. And so once this thing runs out, that means that no more changes are happening, and therefore the movement logic is done. And the way I'm detecting a change is with this dual edge detector thing here. So whenever this goes on, if you keep an eye on that repeater right there. Hold on, can I do this safely? Does this output get blocked before I, let's see, this goes here, that gets blocked. Okay, these are both being blocked. I can do this safely, cool. Yeah, so if you keep an eye on this repeater right here, as I power this, you'll notice that it pulses whenever anything changes. That's a dual edge detector. And it starts this fader clock. And so essentially what happens is anytime something changes, these pulses, that starts this clock again, and so while things are changing, this clock will never run out of power until things stop changing, and then it runs out of power. Pulse gets sent through here, and then these memory cells get reset so that it's accurate to what is currently being displayed. And then at that point, that means that this array of memory cells is now saving the set of legal moves for the piece that we made smart in the last step. The other places your inputs go is through these lines here into these memory cells, and this is going to decode its position and then make a query for if the move that you've entered is legal. So we follow these over here. They just go into another XY detector. Is pretty much exactly the same as the one over there in cyan where we have the two decoders for row and column. They eventually meet up. Here's the output, here's the columns, here's a row output. And this part's kind of cool because remember that at this point our purple here memory cells are storing the locations of all of the legal moves for the piece that is currently selected. So this one's legal, all those other ones are illegal, right? So once one of these torches goes on, it goes, I hit the wrong button. So this torch goes on, it goes through this repeater into these two adjacent redstone lines, and those goes into these torches, which turn off both pieces of redstone dust on either side of this comparator, as well as this one. And so what that ends up being is that even though we're turning off two of these things, we're only unlocking one comparator, which I think is kind of cool, and it's a little clever workaround for doing comparator locks in a too wide space like this, because otherwise things get messy pretty fast, or you have to make it bigger, which is not fun. But yeah, so we have two different lines here. They both come directly from this memory cell. You'll notice one of them is inverted, and so this is the one that says, okay, hey, is this a legal move or an illegal move? The point is, one of these comparators will always be on, either this one or this one. And so when these are both unlocked, I am not in. Why am I? Excuse me. Whatever. The point is, as soon as one of those comparators unlocks, it lets a signal through into this piston or this piston, and then there's two separate lines. This one goes over to this way for if the move is not allowed, and this one lines or flashes if the move is allowed and comes over here, and they both end up getting collected by these lines over here. If the move you make is legal, then the first place it comes is over to this line right in the middle of the board, and that's going to set off the save process for the buffers. So you'll recall that the problem that these buffers solve is related to check. So if you say make a move, but that move would leave you in check, there's no way for the piece logic to know that, because in order to know that information, you need to know all the legal moves for your opponent. So the way I solved that problem was this buffer. So what I do is before a move is made, I save the state of the board entirely within this buffer. That way, if the move you make ends up being illegal, I can completely revert the board state after the fact. And this purple buffer is what allows me to do that. And it's actually a pretty simple concept. Basically, each one of the memory cells has this little thing attached to it, which is a repeater that's locked that acts as a D flip-flop. And then that goes down into this comparator that is currently blocked. And so what happens is at the beginning of the move, this repeater is unlocked so that if there's a signal here, then it's allowed to go in. And then when I need to revert a move, this comparator is unblocked so that it's able to power on if there was a piece here. And then if pieces are deleted, then obviously it gets handled by the move itself, so I don't really need to worry about that too much. So yeah. Buffers. They were way harder than they should have been because I added them at the very last minute after everything else was already in place. I think it's actually worth showing this off real quick, how convoluted some of these circuits had to get because of that. Because like some of them are pretty straightforward. Like, you know, there's not a whole ton of stuff in the way for the knights. But like this one, the rooks, I had to like do this weird piston thing to get the redstone block down there to block the repeater. And then the comparator was this nice like... this nice weird tower thing going on here. The queens and the bishops, I had to do something similar of just like weird, ridiculous looking. So, these ones had to do it in reverse. These ones were super messy because this one had to go the repeaters on the bottom and the comparators on the top. And so, it was a mess. These things are horrible. You should plan these things out better in advance. Don't do what I did. Right, when you make a legal move, the other place your inputs go is to this red line here. Now what this does is this waits a bit until the buffer magic that I just discussed happens. Once the buffers are saved, we start the process of actually making the move. Now, you'll remember that the process of making a move basically looks like you send one delete pulse to the square where the piece currently is. You send a delete pulse to the square where it's moving to, so that gets rid of any piece that's already there, and then you send an add pulse that corresponds to the square that you are moving to. So the way this is done is that all of the delete and adds go through this set of signal strength decoders, and this just turns into another XY decoder, more or less exactly like the cyan wool one, except the only difference is this one goes to either the add line or the delete line. And so that's being blocked by these two pistons right here. So there's a little timing circuit that pulls back these pistons at specific times to send those pulses at the correct intervals. Then the inputs for these come from one of two places. The first place is, if we follow this red line back here, this is the inputs or the memory cells that currently store the location of the piece that you initially selected. So this is essentially the square that you are moving from. The other one is from these lines here, which you'll recall are storing the location of the square that you're moving to. And those inputs are swapped by these sets of pistons. So you'll notice, like right now, looks like both of these are blocked. But depending on the state of the thing, these will block and unblock the correct lines at the correct times so that these both feed into here so that they can go up here. The only part that's tricky about this is timing the add and deletes, because right now you'll notice that the add and deletes are both going through the same sets of circuits. So you may be wondering, when they get to the actual square, how do they know which one is being added and which one is being deleted? And the answer is, if I can find one of these things, let's see. Where is the actual decoding happen? Here we go. So here's one of the row inputs. The column input looks like it is, it's this repeater here. So this is from one of the column inputs. This repeater is from one of the row inputs. So every one of these squares has one of these blocks where you have two repeaters going on the other side, and one of these goes to the delete line, so that's this one here, and one of these goes and is blocking the add line here. And so what happens is that once both of these turn off, one of these lines will also turn off, be it delete or add, and which one turns off is controlled by this line here. So right now you'll notice that this torch is off, and so it is in delete mode. If this line were to be flipped, then this line would be off. I hit the wrong button. And so it would be in add mode. This line is controlled, if we go over here, by a memory cell, or either that or it's a direct derivative of yeah, so a memory cell right here. This is the add and delete controller, essentially, and it will get flipped at precisely the right time so that during a move, you're adding or deleting, depending on the timing of the thing. It's just a bit of precise timing is really all it is. The other thing that I probably should have mentioned earlier, but I didn't, so I'll mention it now, is where this green stuff comes from. Because the question that, or the problem this solves is that once you add a piece, you need to know what piece you're adding. And the answer to that question is that you're adding the piece that's being moved. So if I'm moving a pawn straight forward, then I'm adding a pawn to the new square. And so these here connect eventually to, if we follow this line back, to this memory cell over here from the movement logic. You'll recall this thing stores the identity of the piece that's being moved, 1 through 6 corresponding to pawn through king. And so there's one of these on each side that comes up to these green lines and gets placed into the right signal strength and is being blocked normally until it's unlocked by the movement circuits. So all in all, movement, while I suppose somewhat simple in concept, ends up actually being pretty complicated just because there's a lot of pieces that start to come together here and a lot of really precise timing that goes into this. And so there are a lot of bugs, and I was making it initially of exactly how long I had to wait between all of the pulses in the timing circuit down there, and exactly how long it would take to, between when I flipped that memory cell versus to, have that update propagated to all of the squares and things like that. And so there's a lot of precision that's actually going on here that kind of just happens and just looks cool, but was difficult to set up. Right after you make a move, the next thing we have to do is check if you're in check, or as I like to call it, the check. And so the way that I detect that the move is done is based on the add delete line changing. So right now it's in delete mode. Once it changes to add mode, that means that we're almost done with the move. So when we wait a little bit, this line will turn on, and a couple things are going to happen. So first, when this line turns on, that means that we are done making the move. So the next step is to determine what all of the legal moves for your opponent are, because if you are making the move, then your opponent is the one who's going to put you in check. So that is done by turning off all of these white terracotta lines, and those come over here and hook into the smarts for the pieces. Remember, those are the blue wool things here. The only trick here is that doing this for all 64 pieces on the board is super laggy. And there was a time when I first built this thing where I would make a move and my tick speed would drop to a whole second per game tick. It was ridiculous. So I added this circuit that hooks up to the game state manager that basically says, okay, whose turn it is, or whose turn is it, and only make the opponent's pieces smart. And so that means that instead of putting 64 pieces through the board, you're putting at most 20 pieces through the movement logic, which is much, much easier. It also has the benefit of retaining the legal moves for yourself, so you don't have to recalculate those at the end if it's wrong. So, end result of all of this is that once this line turns off, your opponent's pieces go through the movement logic. The other part of this then is that a signal comes over here, depending on whose turn it is, and starts the movement logic timer. And this, remember, is essentially saying, okay, I understand you're calculating what moves are legal, so this pulse will go off here. once that calculation is done. Once that calculation is done, we come down here, and we now need to ask, okay, what is the location of our king? And if that location is a legal move for your opponent, that means that the king is in check, and that move is not legal. And so I have these black and white lines here that are the king locators. They always have the position of the king in them. I'll talk about how exactly we're getting that, but right now, these are row and column, so you'll notice the white king is in row 1, column 5. The black king is in row 8, column 5, which means that they're at opposite ends of the board, is in their starting position right now. So we make that query, and obviously, depending on the results of that query, we do two different things. We say, one, if your king is not in check, then this line turns on, and this advances the game state manager and progresses to the next player's turn. If your king is in check, then we need to go to the side of the board that initiated the movement and do a couple things. So one, this line here will play the bad sound, which basically says you did something illegal. It'll reset some memory that needs to happen. The other thing that will happen is it will trigger the buffers to load their results back into the board, so that will restore all of the pieces to their original locations. And we also just need to make sure to delete the pieces from their new locations. So if we moved a piece forward, we need to delete it from its new location, and that's handled here before the buffers load it into, or load the pieces back, and they would then load it back into their old location. So that is essentially the check. It's you finish a move, put all the enemy's pieces through movement logic, determine if your king is in check, and if so, undo that move. If not, then you could advance the game. There's a lot of crisscrossing going on here because, you know, we're going from you making a move to checking your opponent's legal moves to coming back here and making changes on your side of the board. But it's essentially the same circuit on both sides, so I was able to skip all that and just pretend that it was fine. Don't worry about it. The way the calculation, or the way the positions of the kings are calculated, is done through this thing here. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm breaking each column into 4 sections, or two sections of 4 spots each. I can't talk. So for each king, this is the memory cell. This input comes through here. And these inputs go through these furnaces and are very specifically tuned so that by the time this wire reaches this comparator, the signal strengths are 1, 2, 3, 4 exactly in order. And then same for the other 4 things up here. The signal strengths are 1, 2, 3, 4 by the time it reaches these repeaters. Then these things are just combined so that we end up with a column of 1 through 8 just going in order. I don't actually remember which direction it goes, but it doesn't really matter. So that tells us if the king is in this row, what column it's in. And so that comes over here. And then we also power the correct signal strength of the row for whichever one we're in. So that ends up being that we get the column from this thing, and we get the row from the other line. And that just becomes the position of the king, and the same thing's repeated on the other side. And while I'm here, I would briefly like to talk about how black the black concrete is. I really love it because it actually just looks like a glitch. And I have spent far too long just staring at this. Like, it shouldn't be like this, right? Am I going insane? It shouldn't be this black. Right, with the check out of the way, that covers most of the core game logic. All that's really left are a couple special cases, and one of those is castling. Now, castling actually has a fair amount of stuff put into it, just because there's a lot of conditions, and then it's a fairly complicated action to take once those conditions are met. So, in order for castling to be allowed, the rules are that the king cannot have moved from its original position. So that's this line here. You notice there's a little memory cell in here that will get its state changed once the king moves. The rooks cannot have moved from their initial position. So that's the blue lines that go all the way over to the rooks. There are similar memory cells over there that store whether or not the rooks have moved. There is not allowed to be a piece between the king and the rook that is castling. So that's taken just from the inputs up here. You'll recall that these things store the locations of each piece, and so I just take a wire here and say if there's a piece here, then that will block these comparators. And if all those are true, then these comparators will be unlocked, so that way when you put the king through when you make the king the active piece in the movement logic, the signal will be allowed through, and one or both of these memory cells will be turned on to say that casting to the right is legal or casting to the left is legal. It is worth mentioning that in actual chess, there is a rule that none of the squares the king moves across can be threatened by an enemy piece, but that rule is actually not implemented in my game because doing that would require essentially every move to take twice as long, and it's already super slow. And so I decided that that's such a minor rule; it doesn't really have that much of an effect on the game, anyways. More often than not, at least to my knowledge. I'm not actually good at chess though, so who knows? But I ended up deciding just to not do it because it's much more entertaining and much easier to use if you don't have to sit here for literal hours. Anyways, once one of these things, thanks Windows, you deactivated my game. Very sick. So once one of these lines come on, they come down here to be special cases in the movement circuit. So you'll recall that this gray line here, I think it's technically cyan terracotta. Yeah, but this line here lights up with the position of the square that you're moving to. And so I've added a special case here because the input for a castle is not actually a legal move according to the king's movement logic. So a special case of if you're moving in this correct row and column, then one of these things will, in this case, turn off one of these lines, and that activates the special castle moving circuit. Now, the movement circuit for this is fairly complicated because castling, unlike every other move, requires 4 pulses. You have delete the king and the rook, and then replace both the king and the rook. And so there's a lot of weird special timing things that are super spaghetti that I don't remember at all and don't have the patience to figure out how they work again. But essentially, it's a whole bunch of special cases and, weird things hardwired directly into specific locations in the movement circuit here that make those 4 pulses with those specific squares happen so that the castle occurs correctly. And then there's a bunch of other lines that go to other random places to hook into, specific pieces of memory or specific checks. So, this one holds this line on so that I don't start the check prematurely. Or, one of these goes over to the other side of the board so that it doesn't reset some specific memory cells in the check too early because I had a very, the way I was doing that was based on when this gray line got deleted, but that line gets deleted at a different time because castling it's such a weird move. There's a lot of really special cases going on, and I built this long enough ago that I really don't remember what all of them are. But essentially, that's the bulk of castling is the part up there that determines when castling is legal, the part in this timing circuit down here that makes all of those 4 pulses happen, and then a bunch of wires that go all over the place that hold all of the random memory cells in exactly the right position so that castling doesn't destroy the entire game in the process. All right, pawn promotion is one that looks more complicated than it actually is, just because there's a lot of lines going back and forth all over the place. But it, in reality, is actually pretty simple. So it starts up here. We're on the white side of the board because the white pawns, when they get to the top, get promoted. And so it begins with us figuring out, okay, there's a pawn that we have to promote. We need to know what column it is in. And so this works pretty much the same way as this worked for the kings, where we have these very specific sets of signal strength that are exactly 1 through 4 by the time they get here. And then this one has the same thing. They meet up, and then we have a identifier 1 through 8 that signifies what square this pawn is in. And this information travels all the way to the back of the board where the controls are. And depending on what its signal strength is going to unlock one of these special circuits. So for instance, if we have whatever this signal strength is, probably 1, looking at it. When it comes down here, this torch will turn off and this comparator will be unlocked. And so this will unlock the pawn promotion circuit. It's a special circuit because it is a special case. The other thing that goes on, if we come back here, is we have a single line that turns off whenever pawn promotion is happening. So that's this line here. We have this nice thing of instant wire that goes all the way across the board. Back here. And this does 2 things. One, it's going to come up here and block this. It's going to lock this piston on. Remember, this is the line that says what piece you've selected, and it uses this to add that piece to the board normally. So this in pawn promotion would be set to 1. That corresponds to a pawn. And so we're blocking that signal from coming in. We're also going to the other side of the board because before we do a pawn promotion, we want to make sure that the check passes, which means this move is legal. So that comes all the way over here and redirects the output for the check. If the check passes, which means the king is not in check, then instead of going through this line, it goes down into this line. Because instead of advancing the game state manager, we want to come back over here and prompt the player for what piece they want their pawn to become. So we come over here, and eventually what happens is this thing gets turned on, we play a sound, and the pawn promotion thing opens up, and so the player can click one of these buttons and select what piece they want. I don't want to actually do that because I'm pretty sure it will break something just because I don't have all the memory in the right spot, so we're just going to turn this off real quick. Anyways, once you hit one of those 4 buttons, they come out over here. They go into one of these 4 inputs, and then they go back to the back of the board because that's where all of the controls happen. So we come back here, and when we get here, there's going to be a little circuit that once again translates these into adjacent signal strengths so that by the time they get to this comparator, they're 1 through 4. There's a little bit of timing here to make sure that if you pressed multiple buttons before the thing closed, only the first one gets through, so I don't have any, double pieces or anything like that, because that's not good. But once this line lights up, this comes over here. At this point, 1 through 4 corresponds to the specific piece that you want this pawn to become. We follow it all the way up here. It goes all the way up to the top of the board, and eventually is going to merge in back with this green line that corresponds to what piece we want to add. So that comes in here. We show up, and once one of these turns on, you'll recall that one of these will be turned off. One of these pieces of redstone dust, meaning the pawn promotion circuit will be unlocked. And once this happens, 2 things happen. First, it comes over here and deletes the pawn that's there currently, and then it waits a bit of time with this really nice, just throw a bunch of comparators at it because they need to create delay, but maintain the signal strength, and then that adds the piece that was selected by the player. So the end result is that the pawn is deleted, the new piece is added, and the game state manager is advanced just like a normal move was made. And then obviously the same thing is repeated on the other side of the board for the black pawns. All right, and that covers pretty much everything that I have to say about how this board works. I know that I didn't cover everything super in-depth, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask them to me on some platform. I will do my best to answer them, although keep in mind that this project has been in the works for over a year. There's a good chance I don't remember something if I didn't mention it in the video. So with that in mind, this is the end of the video. I've got nothing else to say. So until next time, which, at this rate might not be for 2 or 3 years, this is Jamal116 signing off.